What if I told you this isn't really about tariffs? It's not just about trade, and it's definitely not just about politics. What's happening between the United States and India right now is a pressure test, a clash of power, principles, priorities, and prophecy. Why would a former US president threaten a 25% tariff on one of the world's fastest growing nations? Why now? And why does this moment matter more than most people realize? Stay with me, because by the end of this message, you'll understand not only why the US is pressuring India, but what this reveals about global power, moral influence, and the kind of leadership the world is desperately searching for right now. Power has a way of telling on itself. It doesn't always speak loudly, but it always speaks clearly. When power feels secure, it negotiates. When power feels confident, it collaborates. But when power feels threatened, it pressures, it postures. It raises its voice not to persuade, but to remind. And that's why every time you see a threat, especially one wrapped in policy language and economic numbers, you should ask a deeper question. What fear is hiding underneath this show of strength? The pressure the United States is placing on India right now is not rooted in weakness on India's side. It's rooted in growth. It's rooted in momentum. It's rooted in a shift that is unsettling the balance that has existed for decades. Because history shows us this truth again and again. Rising influence makes established power uncomfortable. Not because progress is wrong, but because control is addictive. And once you've been at the center of decision making for long enough, the idea of sharing that influence feels like loss, even when it isn't. Here's what we need to understand. Nations don't fear collapse as much as they fear replacement. They don't fear failure as much as they fear irrelevance. And when a country like India begins to strengthen its economic base, diversify its trade partnerships, expand its manufacturing, assert its strategic autonomy, and refuse to be boxed into one geopolitical camp, it disrupts an old script. It tells the world that power doesn't have to flow in only one direction anymore. That growth doesn't need permission. That alignment doesn't have to mean submission. And when that happens, pressure follows. A 25% tariff threat isn't just a financial calculation. It's a signal. It's a raised eyebrow on the global stage. It's power saying, we'll still decide how expensive your independence will be. Because tariffs aren't designed first to punish economies. They're designed to influence behavior. They are leverage tools. They are reminders. They are warnings dressed up as policy. And when you understand that, you realize this isn't a conversation about trade deficits or manufacturing standards. It's a conversation about control. Think about how pressure works in everyday life. When someone is confident in their position, they don't need to threaten you. When someone knows they have earned respect, they don't have to demand it. Threats show up when persuasion stops working. Pressure enters the room when influence starts slipping out the door. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. The United States is not pressuring India because India lacks importance. The US is pressuring India because India has too much of it to ignore. India represents something dangerous to the old order optionality, the ability to choose, the refusal to be locked into a single narrative. And in a world where global power has long depended on predictable alliances and controlled dependencies, a nation that insists on strategic independence becomes a variable that cannot be easily managed. Variables create uncertainty, and uncertainty makes powerful systems nervous. Craig Groeschel often says that what you fear most will shape the decisions you make. Fear pushes people to overreact. Fear makes leaders loud when wisdom would call for restraint. Fear creates urgency where patience would produce better results. And on a national level, fear doesn't disappear just because the stakes are larger. it multiplies. Because now the fear isn't just about losing influence, it's about losing identity, losing the role of being the one who sets the terms. When the United States uses tariffs as a threat, it's revealing a deeper concern that the global economic center of gravity is shifting, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. Manufacturing hubs are diversifying, supply chains are being reimagined, emerging economies are no longer content to play supporting roles. They want a seat at the table, and not just a seat, a voice. Power reacts to that in one of two ways. It either adapts or it resists. Adaptation requires humility. Resistance relies on force. And force, even economic force, is almost always the language of fear. What makes this moment even more significant is timing. This pressure doesn't come at a moment of Indian instability. It comes at a moment of Indian acceleration, rising GDP, expanding digital infrastructure, strategic partnerships across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. A growing role in global manufacturing as companies look to reduce reliance on single country supply chains. These are not signs of fragility. These are signs of confidence. And confidence in others often triggers insecurity in those who are used to being the default choice. This is where leadership matters, because real leadership doesn't respond to growth with intimidation. It responds with vision. It doesn't try to slow others down. It finds ways to grow together. But pressure politics isn't about shared growth. It's about maintaining hierarchy. And hierarchies depend on someone staying on top. The irony is this pressure often accelerates the very thing it's trying to stop. When you threaten a nation with tariffs, you don't just strain that relationship. You push that nation to explore alternatives, new partners, new markets, new systems. Pressure teaches independence faster than encouragement ever could. And that's why fear-based power is ultimately self-defeating. It may win compliance in the short term, but it breeds resistance in the long term. From a values perspective, this moment exposes a deeper tension. Do we believe leadership is about dominance or stewardship? Is strength proven by how loudly you can threaten or by how effectively you can inspire cooperation? Craig Groeschel's leadership philosophy reminds us that when leaders lead from fear, they shrink their future. Fear narrows vision. It limits options. It replaces wisdom with urgency. And on a global scale, fear-driven leadership doesn't just affect one nation. It ripples across markets, alliances, and generations. This keynote matters because it reframes the narrative. It reminds us that power isn't revealed in what it controls, but in how it reacts when control is challenged. The pressure on India tells us more about American anxiety than Indian behavior. It tells us that the world is changing faster than some systems are comfortable admitting. And instead of adjusting the structure, the instinct is to reinforce it with force. But force is not the same as authority. Threats are not the same as leadership, and pressure is not the same as partnership. When you zoom out, you see that this is not an isolated incident. It's part of a broader pattern. As new powers rise, old powers test their boundaries. As influence spreads, control tightens. As independence grows, pressure follows. This isn't about one tariff or one administration or one policy decision. It's about a global system in transition, where fear and faith are competing for control of the future. And the question that lingers beneath this keynote is not whether power will react when it feels threatened, but whether it will have the courage to evolve instead of intimidate, whether leaders will choose wisdom over dominance, whether influence will be earned through trust rather than enforced through pressure, whether strength will be measured by how tightly it can hold on or how boldly it can adapt, because power always reveals what it fears. And right now, what's being revealed is not weakness in India. But uncertainty in a world where control is no longer guaranteed and the future belongs to those who can lead without needing to threaten, without needing to pressure, without needing to remind others of their authority. Because true authority doesn't need to announce itself when it walks into the room, and especially not when the room itself is changing and the old rules no longer apply, and the fear underneath the pressure becomes the loudest voice in the conversation while pretending to be strategy. Tariffs sound like numbers, percentages, spreadsheets, economic forecasts, and trade balances. On the surface, they appear technical, boring, and transactional. But tariffs have never been just about money. They are about messages. They are about leverage. They are about drawing invisible lines and daring someone to cross them. And when a tariff is threatened publicly, loudly, and deliberately, it stops being an economic tool and becomes a political statement with moral consequences. A 25% tariff is not designed merely to protect domestic industries or correct trade imbalances. It is designed to create discomfort, to apply pressure where it hurts enough to force reconsideration. Because money in global politics is one of the most efficient ways to influence behavior without firing a single shot. It's cleaner than war, quieter than sanctions, but just as intentional. Tariffs are economic consequences disguised as policy, and policy is power dressed up as administration. Craig Groeschel often talks about the danger of mistaking activity for impact. Just because something looks practical doesn't mean it isn't deeply personal. And on a national scale, tariffs are personal. They affect workers, farmers, manufacturers, families, and entire supply chains. They shift costs. They alter decisions. They create winners and losers. And the ones who feel the weight first are rarely the policymakers who announce them. They are the people on the ground who had no voice in the negotiation, but pay the price for the outcome. That's why tariffs are such a powerful tool. They don't just hit balance sheets, they hit confidence. They introduce uncertainty into planning. They make businesses hesitate. They slow momentum. And when applied strategically, they become a signal to leadership: comply, align, adjust, or absorb the pain. That's the unspoken language behind every tariff threat. It's not an invitation to dialogue, it's a demand for response. In the case of US pressure on India, the tariff threat functions as a test of loyalty, a test of alignment, a test of how far India is willing to go to preserve its strategic independence when the cost of doing so suddenly rises. This is not about whether India exports too much or imports too little. This is about whether India will recalibrate its geopolitical posture to reduce friction with American interests. Tariffs become the price tag on independence. And this is where the conversation moves beyond economics into ethics. Because when money is used as leverage to shape national decisions, it raises a fundamental question: should economic power be used to coerce alignment, or should it be used to build mutual prosperity? Craig Groeschel's leadership lens would challenge us here. Healthy leadership seeks understanding before enforcement. It values relationship over control. But tariff threats flip that order. They enforce first and explain later. There's a reason tariffs are announced publicly. They're not whispered behind closed doors. They're broadcast. They're framed. They're positioned as strong leadership because tariffs are as much about domestic audiences as international ones. They send a message at home. We're tough. We're protecting our interests. We're standing up. And in that sense, tariffs become performative. They are not just economic tools. They are political symbols designed to reassure voters that power is being exercised. But performative strength often masks strategic insecurity. When leadership feels the need to demonstrate toughness, it's usually because confidence is eroding somewhere beneath the surface. And that's why tariffs are rarely a sign of long-term vision. They are short-term pressure tactics meant to force immediate concessions. They rarely address root issues, they rarely build trust, and they almost always leave scars. For India, the message behind the tariff threat is clear alignment has benefits and independence has costs. And that's a difficult message for any nation to receive, especially one with a long history of non-alignment and sovereign decision-making. India is not just navigating trade relationships, it is navigating identity. What kind of nation does it want to be in a world where economic interdependence is often used as a control mechanism? Craig Groeschel frequently emphasizes that what you choose to prioritize under pressure reveals your true values. Pressure strips away pretense. It forces clarity, and this moment is a pressure moment. The tariff threat forces India to weigh short-term economic pain against long-term strategic autonomy. It asks whether convenience is worth compromise. And those are never easy decisions, whether you're leading a company, a church, or a country. Tariffs also expose the imbalance in how power operates globally. Not every nation has the ability to impose economic pain without suffering immediate consequences itself. Large economies can absorb shocks longer. Smaller or developing economies feel them faster. That imbalance turns tariffs into a tool of asymmetric power. They are not just about fairness in trade, they are about who can afford to wait longer for the other side to blink. And that dynamic matters because it shapes future behavior. When nations see tariffs used as coercion, they begin to hedge. They diversify. They look for alternatives. They build parallel systems. Because no one wants to be vulnerable to pressure they cannot control. Ironically, the more tariffs are used as threats, the more they accelerate the fragmentation of the global economic system. Trust erodes. Cooperation weakens, and resilience becomes more valuable than efficiency. From a leadership perspective, this is a warning sign. Craig Groeschel often says that leaders who rely on positional power eventually lose relational power. Tariffs are positional. They say, we can do this because we can, but relational power says, we don't need to do this because we've built trust. When relational power fades, positional power becomes louder, and louder rarely means stronger. The danger with tariff-driven pressure is that it normalizes economic intimidation. It teaches the world that strength is measured by how effectively you can impose costs on others. And once that mindset takes hold, cooperation becomes transactional, fragile, and temporary. Alliances become conditional. Partnerships become strategic rather than sincere. And every decision is filtered through the question, what will it cost me if I say no? This is why tariffs are never just about money. They are about influence. They are about hierarchy. They are about reminding others where they stand. And in a rapidly changing world where emerging economies are demanding greater voice and autonomy, that reminder is increasingly being challenged. For the United States, the tariff threat is a way to slow the pace of change, to remind rising nations that access to markets comes with expectations. But for India, the same threat becomes a catalyst, a reminder that economic independence is not fully secure until leverage is reduced. That dependence always carries risk. And that true sovereignty requires the ability to withstand pressure without being forced to compromise core priorities. Craig Groeschel's teaching on stewardship speaks powerfully here. Stewardship isn't about owning everything, it's about managing what you've been entrusted with wisely. When nations use economic power to coerce rather than collaborate, they are choosing control over stewardship. They are prioritizing immediate advantage over long-term stability. And history has shown us that this approach rarely ends well. Tariffs may move numbers on a spreadsheet, but they also move hearts and minds. They shape how nations perceive one another. They influence public opinion. They harden attitudes. And once mistrust sets in, it's difficult to reverse. Even if tariffs are later removed, the memory of pressure lingers. The lesson learned is not easily forgotten. This keynote invites us to look beyond the headlines and see the deeper reality. This isn't about trade deficits or manufacturing protection. This is about power signaling, about influence negotiation, about whether economic tools will be used to build shared prosperity or enforce compliance. And as long as tariffs are used as threats rather than tools of cooperation, they will continue to reveal the underlying struggle for control in a world that is no longer willing to accept old hierarchies without question. Because money may be the language of tariffs, but influence is the message, pressure is the method, and alignment is the expectation. And the real cost is not measured in dollars or percentages, but in trust, autonomy, and the long-term shape of global leadership as nations learn that economic power can either unite or divide, build or break, invite or intimidate. And every time it is used as a threat, it leaves behind a deeper question about what kind of world is being built when prosperity is leveraged as a weapon rather than shared as a partnership. Every nation claims to act in its own national interest. That phrase sounds noble, rational, even responsible. But national interest becomes complicated when it collides with global influence, because what a nation wants for itself does not always align with what powerful systems want for the world. And in that collision, pressure emerges, alliances strain, and leadership is tested in ways that go far beyond policy documents and press conferences. India is standing at that collision point right now. On one side is its national interest, economic growth, strategic autonomy, diversified partnerships, and the right to make decisions based on its own priorities rather than external expectations. On the other side is global influence shaped largely by established powers that are accustomed to setting the rules, defining acceptable behavior, and expecting alignment in exchange for access and support. When these two forces meet, friction is inevitable. Craig Groeschel often teaches that clarity creates confidence, but conflict reveals character. And this moment is revealing the character of global leadership structures. Because when national interest aligns with global expectations, cooperation is celebrated. But when national interest diverges, pressure replaces partnership. Influence becomes enforcement. And what was once framed as mutual benefit starts to sound like obligation. India's position is uniquely challenging because it refuses to fit neatly into a single geopolitical box. It engages with Western economies while maintaining relationships with non-Western powers. It participates in global forums while guarding its sovereignty. It seeks investment without surrendering decision-making authority. This balancing act is not indecision, it is intentional strategy. But intentional strategy often looks like defiance to those who prefer predictability. Global influence depends on predictability. Systems of power function best when behavior can be anticipated, alliances can be counted on, and outcomes can be managed. When a nation asserts independence, it introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty makes powerful actors uncomfortable. That discomfort is often reframed as concern, framed as stability, framed as responsibility. But beneath the language lies a desire for control. This is where national interest becomes controversial, because asserting national interest in a globalized world can be interpreted as selfishness, even when it is simply self-determination. Craig Groeschel's leadership philosophy reminds us that healthy boundaries are often misunderstood by those who benefit from access. When you decide to say no, those who are used to your yes will question your motives. And on a global scale, that dynamic plays out with far higher stakes. India's national interest includes maintaining strategic neutrality in conflicts that do not directly threaten its security, protecting domestic industries while integrating into global markets and ensuring energy security through diverse sourcing. None of these goals are unreasonable. In fact, they are prudent. But prudence does not always align with the expectations of dominant powers that view global issues through the lens of their own priorities. Global influence often demands alignment on issues that extend beyond economics. It touches defense, diplomacy, technology standards, and even values. And when a nation chooses a different path, it can be labeled as uncooperative, unreliable, or resistant. Those labels become tools of influence themselves. They shape narratives. They justify pressure. They prepare domestic audiences for policies that might otherwise seem aggressive. This is where leadership becomes deeply personal, because national leaders are not just managing data, they are managing identity. They are deciding how their nation will be seen and how much pressure it is willing to endure to remain true to its chosen path. Craig Groeschel emphasizes that leadership requires the courage to disappoint people for the sake of long-term purpose. And that courage is rare, especially when the disappointment comes from powerful allies. The collision between national interest and global influence also exposes an imbalance in how choices are judged. When powerful nations act in their national interest, it is framed as realism. When emerging nations do the same, it is framed as defiance. The same behavior is interpreted differently based on who is doing it. That double standard fuels resentment and accelerates the desire for a more multipolar world where influence is distributed rather than concentrated. India's rise amplifies this tension. As its economic and political weight increases, its decisions matter more. And the more they matter, the more scrutiny they attract. Global influence seeks to shape those decisions to ensure they align with existing power structures. But national interest demands flexibility, adaptation, and the freedom to respond to changing circumstances. When those demands conflict, compromise becomes costly. Craig Groeschel often speaks about the difference between being called and being liked. Leaders who prioritize being liked will avoid conflict. Leaders who prioritize their calling will endure it. On a national level, the same principle applies. A nation that prioritizes approval will sacrifice autonomy. A nation that prioritizes purpose will accept pressure. And this moment forces a choice between comfort and conviction. The U.S. pressure on India, including tariff threats, can be understood as an attempt to resolve this collision in favor of global influence rather than national interest. It is a reminder that participation in the global system comes with expectations. But it also raises a critical question: who defines those expectations and who benefits from them? Global influence is not inherently negative. Shared standards, cooperation, and coordination have driven decades of growth and stability. But when influence becomes rigid, when it resists adaptation, it turns into dominance. And dominance breeds resistance. India's insistence on maintaining strategic autonomy is not an attack on the global system. It is a response to a system that has not always accommodated the aspirations of emerging powers. This collision also reveals the limits of pressure-based leadership. You can influence behavior through incentives and penalties, but you cannot force genuine alignment. Compliance achieved through pressure is fragile. It lasts only as long as the pressure remains effective. True partnership requires respect for national interest, even when it complicates global agendas. Craig Groeschel's teachings on trust are relevant here. Trust is built when parties believe their interests will be respected, not overridden. When trust erodes, every interaction becomes transactional. Every agreement is provisional. Every alliance is questioned. And that erosion has long-term consequences that far outlast any single policy dispute. India's challenge is not just to navigate current pressure, but to shape a future in which its national interest is recognized as legitimate within the global system. That requires resilience, clarity, and strategic patience. It requires the willingness to absorb short-term costs to protect long-term autonomy. And it requires leaders who understand that influence gained through integrity is more durable than influence enforced through pressure. This keynote underscores a fundamental truth: global leadership is being renegotiated in real time. As new powers rise, the old framework strain, national interest, and global influence will continue to collide, not because either is wrong, but because the balance between them has not yet been recalibrated. And in that recalibration, pressure will be applied, alliances will be tested, and leadership will be revealed. The outcome of this collision will shape not only trade relationships, but the moral architecture of global leadership. Will influence be exercised through collaboration or coercion? Will national interest be respected or suppressed? Will emerging powers be integrated as partners or managed as variables? These questions are not theoretical. They are being answered through actions, reactions, and the willingness of nations to stand firm when pressure challenges their sense of purpose. Because when national interest collides with global influence, the path chosen in that moment defines more than policy. It defines identity. It reveals priorities, it exposes fears, and it sets the trajectory for how power will be exercised in a world that is no longer willing to accept a single center of gravity, where leadership must evolve or risk becoming irrelevant, where influence must be earned rather than assumed, and where the courage to choose purpose over approval becomes the defining mark of those who shape the future. There are two very different ways to lead, whether you're guiding a person, an organization, or a nation. One leads through threat. The other leads through trust. One demands compliance. The other inspires commitment. And the difference between these two styles of leadership determines not just short-term outcomes, but long-term legacy. In moments of global tension, the kind of leadership being exercised becomes impossible to hide because pressure amplifies intent and reveals motive. Leadership that threatens is loud. It wants to be seen. It wants to be felt. It relies on leverage, on consequences, on fear of loss. It speaks in ultimatums and conditions. Do this or else. Align or suffer. Fall in line or pay the price. This kind of leadership believes strength is proven by how much discomfort it can impose on others. And in the short term, it often works. Threats can force movement. Pressure can create compliance. Fear can produce immediate results. But leadership that builds operates differently. It is quieter but deeper. It invests before it demands. It listens before it leverages. It understands that lasting influence cannot be forced. It must be earned. This leadership values relationship over reaction and trust over intimidation. It recognizes that true authority doesn't need to shout because it has already established credibility. Craig Groeschel often emphasizes that people don't follow titles, they follow trust. And on a global scale, nations don't align because they are afraid, they align because they believe partnership will lead to shared benefit. When leadership forgets this, it defaults to threats. And every threat reveals a lack of confidence in the relationship. The pressure placed on India through tariff threats is a clear example of leadership choosing to threaten rather than build. Instead of deepening cooperation, encouraging dialogue, or negotiating long-term solutions, pressure is applied to force a recalibration. That approach sends a message not only to India, But to every nation watching, alignment is expected and deviation will be penalized. This kind of leadership creates a climate of caution rather than collaboration. Nations begin to ask not how to work together, but how to protect themselves. They start planning not for growth, but for resilience. Trust erodes, and when trust erodes, influence weakens, because fear-based leadership may secure obedience, but it rarely earns loyalty. Leadership that threatens often confuses control with stability. It assumes that if everyone is in line, the system is secure. But forced order is fragile. It depends on constant enforcement. The moment pressure is lifted, compliance fades. Leadership that builds, however, creates stability through shared ownership. When people believe in the vision, they protect it. When nations believe in the system, they invest in it. Craig Groeschel's leadership teachings consistently return to this truth. What you build matters more than what you win. You can win an argument and lose a relationship. You can win compliance and lose commitment. On a global scale, leadership that threatens may win concessions, but it loses goodwill. And goodwill is a currency that cannot be imposed or replaced once it is spent. Another danger of leadership that threatens is escalation. Threats invite counter-threats. Pressure invites resistance. When one side raises the stakes, the other looks for ways to rebalance power. This creates cycles of retaliation that are difficult to break. Tariffs lead to counter-tariffs. Sanctions lead to workarounds. And each move further entrenches division. Leadership that builds seeks de-escalation. It looks for common ground even when disagreements are sharp. It understands that not every difference needs to become a standoff. This kind of leadership is willing to absorb short-term discomfort to preserve long-term partnership. It recognizes that global stability is not achieved by forcing uniformity, but by managing diversity. The contrast between these two leadership styles becomes even clearer when considering legacy. Leaders who threaten may be remembered for their strength, but rarely for their wisdom. They may dominate headlines, but they seldom shape history in positive ways. Leaders who build may not always appear decisive in the moment, but their influence endures because it is rooted in trust and mutual respect. Craig Groeschel often challenges leaders to ask not what they can get, but what they can give. Leadership that builds gives opportunity. It gives security. It gives dignity. Leadership that threatens takes leverage. It takes confidence. It takes choice. And over time, people and nations grow wary of being led by fear. For India, the experience of being pressured rather than partnered sends a clear signal. It reinforces the need for self-reliance, diversification, and strategic autonomy. It teaches that reliance on a single dominant partner carries risk. And while that lesson may not be the intention behind the threat, it becomes the outcome. Leadership that threatens unintentionally pushes others to build alternatives. From the perspective of the United States, choosing to threaten rather than build may offer immediate leverage, but it undermines long-term influence. Influence is not sustained by power alone. It is sustained by credibility. When partners feel respected, they choose alignment. When they feel coerced, they comply reluctantly and prepare to disengage. Craig Groeschel's framework of servant leadership offers a stark contrast here. Servant leadership asks how power can be used to serve others, not control them. Applied globally, this would mean using economic strength to foster development, resilience, and shared prosperity rather than to extract concessions. It would mean recognizing that strong partners create a stronger system. Leadership that threatens also narrows its own options. Once you choose coercion, backing down becomes difficult without appearing weak. This traps leaders in a cycle of escalation where each move must be stronger than the last. Leadership that builds maintains flexibility. It can adjust, compromise, and adapt without losing credibility because its authority is not tied to domination. The world is watching these leadership choices closely. Emerging nations are evaluating which partnerships offer respect and which demand submission. They are learning which leaders build and which threaten. And those lessons will shape alliances for decades to come. This keynote exposes a fundamental choice facing global leadership today. Will power be exercised through intimidation or invitation? Will influence be maintained through pressure or partnership? Will leadership seek to control outcomes or cultivate trust? These are not abstract questions. They are being answered through real policies, real threats, and real consequences. Craig Groeschel reminds us that leadership is tested most clearly under pressure. Anyone can lead when things are easy. But when uncertainty rises, when control feels threatened, when outcomes are not guaranteed, true leadership reveals itself. And in this moment, the contrast between leadership that threatens and leadership that builds could not be clearer. Because leadership that builds understands that influence is not diminished by sharing power, that strength is not weakened by cooperation, that authority is not lost by listening, and that the most powerful leaders are not those who force others into alignment, but those who create environments where alignment is chosen willingly, where trust replaces fear, where partnership replaces pressure, and where the future is shaped not by ultimatums, but by vision, restraint, and the courage to believe that building together creates far more lasting impact than threatening ever could. Every political decision begins long before it reaches a podium or a policy document. Long before tariffs are announced, before alliances are questioned, before pressure is applied, something deeper is already at work. Beneath economics, beneath strategy, beneath national interest, there is always a belief system operating quietly in the background. Politics may speak the language of power, but it is driven by the language of values, and values are shaped by what leaders ultimately trust, fear, and worship. Craig Groeschel often teaches that everyone places their faith somewhere. If not in God, then in control. If not in truth, then in outcomes. If not in purpose, then in power. Nations are no different. Governments may present themselves as secular and rational, but they are still guided by deeply held assumptions about what brings security, what guarantees survival, and what defines success. Those assumptions form the spiritual undercurrent behind every political decision. When the United States applies pressure on India through tariff threats, the action itself is political, but the motivation beneath it is spiritual in nature. It reveals a belief about how order is maintained in the world. It suggests that stability comes from dominance, that alignment must be enforced, that peace is preserved by ensuring no one moves too far outside established boundaries. These beliefs are rarely spoken out loud, but they shape every move. At the core of this undercurrent is fear. Fear of losing influence, fear of losing relevance, fear of losing control over a system that once felt secure, and fear, when left unchecked, becomes a powerful spiritual driver. Craig Groeschel reminds us that fear is a terrible master. It promises safety but delivers anxiety. It demands control but creates chaos. When fear governs leadership, decisions may appear strong, but they are rooted in insecurity. Political leaders often justify fear-driven decisions by calling them pragmatic or necessary. But necessity is a dangerous word. It can excuse behavior that would otherwise be questioned. It can silence moral reflection. And it can convince leaders that ends justify means. This is where the spiritual dimension becomes critical. Because when leaders stop asking what is right and focus only on what works, they drift from wisdom into expediency. The spiritual undercurrent also reveals what nations believe about power itself. Is power something to be shared or something to be hoarded? Is it a responsibility or a weapon? Is it given in trust or seized by force? These questions are not theological abstractions. They are answered through policies, threats, and alliances. And every answer shapes the moral climate of global leadership. Craig Groeschel often speaks about idols in modern life. Not statues, but subtle replacements for God. Control can be an idol. Security can be an idol. Prosperity can be an idol. When these become ultimate goals, they begin to dictate behavior. On a national level, when economic dominance becomes an idol, nations will justify coercion to protect it. When strategic superiority becomes sacred, pressure becomes acceptable. The pressure placed on India reflects a deeper struggle between trust and control. Trust requires vulnerability. It requires believing that cooperation can work without constant enforcement. Control eliminates that vulnerability, but at a cost. It hardens relationships, it limits dialogue, and it replaces mutual respect with suspicion. Spiritually, control is often chosen when trust feels too risky. Another layer of this undercurrent is pride. Pride is not confidence. It is the refusal to acknowledge limits. It is the belief that one's way is not just preferable, but superior. In global politics, pride manifests as moral certainty without humility. It frames one set of interests as universal and another as problematic. It assumes leadership means direction without dialogue. Craig Groeschel teaches that pride isolates while humility connects. When nations lead with humility, they recognize that wisdom is not centralized, that solutions can be shared, and that progress does not require domination. When pride takes over, influence becomes rigid. It resists change. It punishes divergence, and it often masks itself as strength. The spiritual undercurrent also shapes how leaders view people. Are citizens and partner nations seen as ends in themselves or as means to an objective? When economic tools like tariffs are used primarily as pressure, people become collateral. Workers absorb costs. Consumers face higher prices. Communities feel instability. Spiritually, this reflects a shift from stewardship to exploitation, from care to calculation. Craig Groeschel frequently emphasizes that leadership is stewardship, not ownership. Applied globally, this means economic power should be managed for the good of many, not leveraged for the benefit of a few. When stewardship is replaced by self-preservation, policies become transactional. They ask, what can we extract, rather than what can we build? The spiritual dimension becomes even clearer when considering how narratives are shaped. Political decisions are rarely presented as raw power plays. They are wrapped in moral language: protection, fairness, security, responsibility. These words give ethical cover to actions that may otherwise be questioned. But spiritual discernment asks a deeper question. Do these words align with the outcomes they produce? When pressure creates instability rather than security, when threats erode trust rather than protect it, the moral language begins to ring hollow. Craig Groeschel warns that when leaders lose alignment between their words and actions, credibility erodes. And once credibility is lost, influence weakens, no matter how much power remains. This undercurrent also affects how nations interpret resistance. When a country like India asserts its autonomy, the response reveals underlying beliefs. Is resistance seen as rebellion or as self-determination? Is independence viewed as a threat or as a sign of maturity? These interpretations are not neutral. They are shaped by spiritual posture. A posture rooted in fear interprets independence as danger. A posture rooted in confidence sees it as an opportunity for partnership. Craig Groeschel often notes that secure leaders celebrate strong teams while insecure leaders feel threatened by them. The same principle applies to nations. Secure systems welcome strong partners. Insecure systems try to limit them. Another spiritual layer is the concept of trust in outcomes versus trust in principles. When leaders trust outcomes, they are willing to compromise principles to achieve them. When leaders trust principles, they accept uncertain outcomes with confidence. This distinction matters. Pressure-based politics often trusts outcomes more than principles. It seeks immediate results, even if they undermine long-term values. Craig Groeschel's teaching consistently calls leaders back to principle-centered leadership. Doing the right thing even when it is costly. Choosing integrity over expediency. Believing that faithfulness produces fruit even when results are delayed. On a global scale, this kind of leadership would prioritize fairness, respect, and collaboration, even when pressure could deliver faster compliance. The spiritual undercurrent also influences how success is measured. Is success defined by dominance or by stability, by control or by cooperation, by compliance or by trust? The answers to these questions shape policy decisions more than any economic model, and they reveal what leaders ultimately believe will sustain the world. When pressure is applied through tariffs, it suggests a belief that order must be enforced from the top down. That without pressure, systems will fall apart. But that belief overlooks a deeper truth: systems held together by fear are brittle. They crack under stress. Systems held together by trust are resilient. They adapt, they endure. Craig Groeschel often reminds leaders that faith is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Applied to global leadership, faith would look like choosing cooperation even when control feels safer. It would look like dialogue instead of threats. It would look like patience in a world addicted to immediacy. This keynote invites reflection on what is really driving global decisions. Not just what is happening, but why it is happening. Not just who benefits, but what beliefs are being reinforced. Because political decisions are never spiritually neutral. They reflect what leaders believe about power, people, and the future. And as the world watches these dynamics unfold, the spiritual undercurrent becomes more visible. Fear and faith are both at work. Control and trust are both competing for influence. Pride and humility are both shaping responses. And the choices made in this moment will echo far beyond trade relations, revealing whether global leadership will be guided by anxiety or anchored in wisdom, whether power will be used to protect self-interest or to serve a broader good, whether nations will continue to act from fear of losing control or grow into a posture of confidence that no longer needs to threaten in order to lead. Every moment of tension is also a moment of instruction. History doesn't just happen, it teaches. And this moment where pressure, tariffs, power, and positioning collide is not simply a snapshot of current affairs. It is a preview, a glimpse into the direction the world is moving and the kind of leadership that will be required to navigate what's coming next. Because moments like these don't end when the headlines change. They shape patterns, expectations, and behaviors that ripple forward for decades. What we are witnessing right now is not an isolated dispute between two nations. It is a signal that the global order is shifting from certainty to complexity. For years, power flowed in predictable channels. Alliances were stable. Influence was concentrated. The rules were written by a few and followed by many. But that world is fading, not collapsing overnight, but gradually loosening its grip. And whenever an old system begins to lose its dominance, pressure increases before adaptation begins. Craig Groeschel often says that change exposes what we trust most. When things are stable, trust is invisible. But when the ground starts to shake, whatever we've built our confidence on is revealed. On a global scale, This moment reveals a deep trust in leverage rather than adaptability, in pressure rather than partnership. And that revelation tells us something critical about the future direction of global leadership. The future will not belong to the loudest nation, but to the most resilient one. It will not belong to the most forceful system, but to the most flexible one. This moment teaches us that power rooted in fear reacts, while power rooted in confidence prepares. Tariff threats are reactions. Pressure campaigns are reactions. They are responses to uncertainty, not strategies for stability. And the more the world changes, the less effective reactive leadership becomes. One of the clearest lessons of this moment is that multipolarity is no longer theoretical. It is practical. Economic influence is diversifying. Manufacturing hubs are spreading. Technology ecosystems are fragmenting. Energy routes are being reimagined. And nations that once depended on a single dominant partner are intentionally reducing that dependency. This is not rebellion, it is risk management. And the future will favor those who understand that dependence without alternatives is vulnerability. Craig Groeschel teaches leaders to build margin, not just momentum. Margin allows you to absorb shocks without panic. On a global scale, margin looks like diversified partnerships, domestic capacity, and strategic autonomy. India's position reflects this mindset. It is not rushing to sever ties or escalate conflict. It is building margin. And this moment teaches us that nations with margin will face the future with far more confidence than those who rely solely on leverage. Another lesson is that economic tools will increasingly replace military ones as instruments of pressure. Tariffs, sanctions, access restrictions, and regulatory barriers are becoming the weapons of modern geopolitics. They are less visible than tanks, but no less impactful. This shift means future conflicts may be quieter, slower, and more complex, unfolding over years rather than days. And leadership that lacks patience will struggle in this environment. Craig Groeschel often warns against the trap of short-term wins that sabotage long-term health. Economic pressure can produce short-term concessions, but it also accelerates long-term decoupling. Nations learn, systems adapt, alternatives emerge, and once new pathways are built, the old leverage loses its power. This moment teaches us that every time pressure is applied, it trains others how to live without you. The future will also be shaped by how nations interpret respect. Respect is no longer granted automatically based on historical dominance. It is earned through consistency, fairness, and restraint. Emerging powers are not just seeking economic growth, they are seeking dignity in decision-making. They want to be treated as contributors, not clients. And this moment reveals that the future belongs to leaders who understand that respect cannot be demanded, only demonstrated. Craig Groeschel frequently emphasizes emotional intelligence in leadership. Understanding not just what you want, but how your actions are received. On a global scale, emotional intelligence looks like cultural awareness, historical sensitivity, and humility. This moment teaches us that leadership without emotional intelligence may still function, but it will fracture relationships faster than it builds them. There is also a generational lesson embedded here. Younger generations around the world are watching how power is exercised. They are skeptical of coercion. They are critical of hypocrisy. They value transparency and agency, and they will inherit the systems being shaped today. The future will not look kindly on leadership that relied on intimidation instead of innovation, pressure instead of purpose. Craig Groeschel often talks about legacy as what lasts when you leave the room. For nations, legacy is the system they leave behind. Will it be one of fear and fragmentation or trust and cooperation? This moment teaches us that legacy is being formed not only by what leaders decide, but by how they decide. Process matters. Tone matters. Intention matters. Another critical lesson is that neutrality is becoming a strategic position rather than a weakness. In a polarized world, the ability to engage with multiple sides is valuable. It creates flexibility. It allows mediation. It reduces risk. Pressure against neutrality reveals discomfort with complexity. But the future is complex, and nations that learn to navigate that complexity without being forced into binary choices will have greater freedom. Craig Groeschel teaches that maturity is the ability to hold tension without forcing resolution. Applied globally, maturity looks like allowing nations to pursue their interests without immediate punishment. It looks like accepting disagreement without escalation. This moment teaches us that immature leadership demands instant alignment, while mature leadership allows space for divergence. The future will also test the moral consistency of global leadership. Using values language to justify power plays erodes credibility. Saying one thing while doing another undermines trust. And trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. This moment teaches us that the world is paying attention not just to what leaders say, but to whether their actions align with their stated principles. Craig Groeschel often reminds leaders that influence is always on loan. It can be increased or decreased based on how it is used. No nation owns influence permanently. It is granted by others through trust and cooperation. This moment teaches us that influence hoarded will eventually be resisted, but influence shared will often be multiplied. There is also a lesson about pace. The future will reward patience more than urgency. Pressure-based decisions often come from impatience, from the desire to force outcomes quickly. But global systems move slowly. Cultural shifts take time. Economic realignments unfold over decades. This moment teaches us that leaders who rush may feel decisive, but they often miss deeper currents shaping the future. Craig Groeschel's emphasis on vision over reaction is especially relevant here. Vision sees beyond the next election cycle, the next quarter, the next headline. Vision asks where this decision leads in 10, 20, 30 years. Pressure politics is often vision poor. It focuses on immediate leverage rather than long-term structure. And this moment teaches us that the future belongs to those who think in decades, not days. Finally, this moment teaches us that leadership is being redefined. Strength is no longer measured solely by dominance. It is measured by adaptability, integrity, and the ability to build coalitions without coercion. The world is moving toward a model where leadership must persuade rather than command, collaborate rather than compel, inspire rather than intimidate. Craig Groeschel often says that the greatest test of leadership is not how much control you have, but how much trust you create. This moment reveals that trust is becoming the most valuable currency in global affairs. And as the old systems strain under the weight of change, the future will belong to those who understand that pressure can force movement. But only trust can sustain direction, only vision can guide transition, only humility can navigate complexity, and only leaders who learn from moments like this will be equipped to shape a future that is no longer defined by fear of losing power, but by confidence in sharing it as the world continues to evolve in ways that cannot be stopped, but only stewarded wisely. This moment we've been examining is bigger than tariffs, bigger than politics, and bigger than any single nation. It is a mirror held up to global leadership, reflecting how power behaves when its senses change, how influence reacts when it is no longer absolute, and how fear quietly reshapes decisions that are presented as strategy. What we see between the United States and India is not an exception to history, but a continuation of it, a familiar pattern repeating itself in a new era. Throughout this script, one truth has surfaced again and again: Power always tells the truth about itself under pressure. When leadership is confident, it builds. When leadership is secure, it collaborates. But when leadership feels threatened, it tightens its grip. Tariffs become tools, pressure becomes language, and alignment becomes expectation rather than invitation. These actions reveal not just political priorities, but underlying beliefs about control, trust, and the future. India's position in this moment highlights a shift that can no longer be ignored. The world is no longer organized around a single center of gravity. Influence is spreading, options are multiplying, and nations are increasingly unwilling to trade long-term sovereignty for short-term convenience. Strategic independence is no longer a fringe idea. It is becoming a necessity in a world where economic tools are weaponized and partnerships can turn conditional overnight. At the same time, this moment challenges established powers to rethink what leadership truly means. Is leadership the ability to force compliance, or the capacity to earn cooperation? Is strength measured by how much pressure can be applied, or by how much trust can be sustained? Is global order preserved through intimidation or through mutual respect and shared responsibility? These questions are not philosophical luxuries. They are practical realities shaping the future of international relationships. The spiritual undercurrent beneath these decisions reminds us that fear and faith are always competing forces. Fear drives urgency, control, and coercion. Faith produces patience, wisdom, and restraint. Nations, like individuals, must choose which voice will guide their actions. When fear leads, pressure becomes policy. When faith leads, principles shape progress, even when outcomes are uncertain. What this moment ultimately teaches us is that the future of global leadership will not belong to those who cling most tightly to power, but to those who steward it most wisely. The coming world will reward adaptability over dominance, humility over pride, and collaboration over coercion. Influence will increasingly flow toward leaders and nations that understand trust is not a weakness, that partnership is not surrender, and that sharing power does not diminish authority, but often multiplies it. This is not just a story about the US and India. It is a lesson for every leader, every institution, and every system navigating change. Pressure can move people, but it cannot sustain them. Threats can force decisions, but they cannot build futures. Control can delay transformation, but it cannot stop it. The world is changing, and leadership must change with it. In the end, history will not ask who had the most leverage in this moment. It will ask who showed the most wisdom. It will not remember who applied the greatest pressure, but who built the strongest foundations. And it will not be shaped by those who feared losing power, but by those who were confident enough to lead without needing to threaten, understanding that true leadership is revealed not by how it reacts to rising others, but by how it chooses to shape a future where strength is shared, trust is honored, and influence is earned rather than enforced.